Hello, I'm Craig Barton and welcome to this Tips for Teachers video. Now there's a principle from the cognitive theory of multimedia learning called the coherence principle, and it states this: people learn more deeply when extraneous material is excluded rather than included. Now that may seem like the most obvious thing you've ever heard in your life, but I tell you what, it can't have been obvious to me because for about 12 years my teaching was rammed full of extraneous material. Now there was a fascinating study published in 2020, and I love the title of this, a meta-analysis of the seductive details effect. I became aware of this study when Rob Coe tweeted about it. Just take a moment just to read Rob's tweet there. Now I think many teachers fall into this trap, and I'm going to put my hand up because I certainly do. We include things perhaps on our slides or our worksheets or within our questions that are designed to engage students. A little bit quirky stuff here and there. But what they may be doing is having a detrimental effect on their learning. Because as students or anybody, we've only got a limited amount of attention. We want as much of that attention to be dedicated to the thing that's going to help us learn and understand. If any of that starts drifting off into these seductive details, then potentially we have problems because we have less attention to dedicate to the thing that's going to make a difference. So as a result of this, there's kind of a key principle that I try and stick to, and I'm going to break it down into 4 sections, then show you some examples. So the first is, I always think to myself, what is visible to students is what they're likely to attend to. If they can see something, they've got to process it. It's got to take up some of their attention. Or they've got to effortfully ignore it. They've got to see it, realise it's not relevant and disregard it. But that process isn't costless. That deciding what's relevant and not is effortful, and it saps attention. And if we follow this logic through, what students attend to is what they're likely to remember from the work of Daniel Willingham. So as a result, we've got to be so careful about what's visible to our students. So I'm going to give you a few examples now. Now, the first one is painful for me because I cannot believe I did this. But many, many years ago, I wrote an ebook of notes and examples for my maths students, and I published it on my Mr. Barton Maths website. I'll tell you what, it still exists out there, but I'm tempted to take this down because this does not make me look good. Right, brace yourself. You're about to see a page from that ebook. Ready? I mean, I literally don't know what I was thinking. I don't know what this alien's doing, what role he's got to play in the matter. We've got an arrow pointing here. We've also got loads of different colours and underline and bold. I mean, what's the priority here? Do we look at the red bold, or is the kind of green not bold but underline more important? It's terrible. Full of seductive details that aren't particularly, well, they're not useful at all. But students have got to either look at this alien and either they start thinking about the alien, which isn't ideal, or they've got to look at it and think, is that alien relevant? No, probably not. And then go back to the text. But that's an effortful process. So it's bad. This is just terrible. There's not much fixing to that. But I want to end with a few more subtle examples of this. So this is an interesting one. So this is a maths example, but I'm convinced that this lesson transfers across. Just take a moment, perhaps just to read question 1. So you can see here we've got a maths question. It's to do with kind of ratio and sharing. But we've got seductive details woven in there. We've got Princess Bubblegum's involved, the Ice King, it's all kicking off. Now, one point I want to make really clear here is that certainly what I'm not saying is that these questions are useless, because we need our students, certainly as mathematicians, and I assume this is true of other subjects, to be able to problem solve in the sense that they need to be able to identify what's relevant and what's irrelevant within a certain question. So question 1 is a good question. The point I'm trying to make here is often as teachers, we use questions like this early on in the learning process when students are novice learners, when they're not completely fluent in the concept of ratio in this example. So therefore, we're asking them to sift through what's relevant and what's irrelevant when they're not secure with the actual core material themselves. And I think that's when these seductive details really become harmful. Because if we've got a student who we really need to think hard about ratio, and yet they're thinking about Princess Bubblegum and the Ice King and thinking, is that relevant? Then I think questions like this become problematic. So move these further down, or further along the learning episode to when students are more secure with the basics. And then we ask questions like this, not so they can practice the basics, but so they can practice sifting through relevance and irrelevance. Whereas I think what teachers often do, myself included, is hope you get a kind of 2-for-1 deal with questions like this, that students will learn the basics and learn to sift through relevance and irrelevance. But what I think happens is the seductive details become particularly enticing when you're a novice learner. I'm going to end with perhaps the subtlest example. Now this is from a maths author who I think is absolutely fantastic, Pixie, or Danielle as she's known in the real world. She produces incredible slides, and I was TES maths advisor for about 12 years, so I got to see hundreds of PowerPoints shared. And what's really interesting, when somebody shares, a teacher creates a PowerPoint and shares it with a wide audience like Danielle does and like many people on TES do, they tend to put a load of details in the slide itself. And the reason is they want to communicate to other teachers as much information as possible, how the slide should be used and so on and so forth. But if you look at this, I think we can see the problem straight away. If we want students attending to this, if this is what we want them focusing on, the problem is they've got quite a few seductive details around the outside that they need to ignore. So my solution to things like this is, I'm not a massive fan of learning objectives, full stop, but that's for another day. But let's deal with them first. So if we need to get kids to copy them down for whatever reason, let's get them copied down, the date and the title and so on. And then let's strip all that away and focus in on the example. Let's remove those seductive details. And one interesting approach that I quite like as well is we may want to relate this example to one of those learning objectives. So what we can do perhaps with a bit of PowerPoint animation, we can cover up those seductive details. And then if I just hover my mouse over here, we can click on the learning objectives when they're relevant and say, okay, now let's relate that example to what the lesson's about, where does it fit in and so on and so forth. So just a reminder that that's the core principle and the 4 kind of ideas behind it. And crucially, we need to be very careful about what's visible to our students. So what do you make of that? Have you got seductive details in your lesson? Can you tweak them a little bit and remove them? What would you need to change to make this work for you?